my next speaker, I'm very pleased to say, is Jacques Pauwels, and he has taught European history at a number of universities in Ontario, and that includes York, Waterloo and Guelph. He is the author of The Great Class War, 1914 to 1918, Big Business, and Hitler and the Myth of the Good War, revisionist histories of the rise of fascism and the world wars. His books are read around the world and have been published in French, Italian, Spanish, German, Dutch, Russian, Turkish and Korean. An independent scholar, Pauwels holds PhD in history from York as well as political science from the U of T. He lives in Brantford, Ontario. Thank you, Jacques. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for your kind comments, and thanks to all of you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I would like to make some remarks about something that doesn't exist. Well, at least doesn't exist according to Wikipedia, and because there's no entry in Wikipedia about this phenomenon. And this phenomenon is important because it's the kind of the shadow of fascism, and it's called philofascism. Philofascism is a term of Greek origin, of course, like philosophy. Philos is friend of, and Sophia is wisdom. So the philosophers are the friends of wisdom, of knowledge. So philofascism means friends of fascism. You know, people who like fascism, the way that scholars or some people like knowledge. And philosophy or philofascism then is not mentioned by Wikipedia because it's a dangerous concept. It's something that, in a sense, they prefer would not exist, or at least they don't want you to know that it exists. On the other hand, for those of us who want to look critically at fascism, it's very good to know what it means, because it means this. It means focus on the people who actually like fascism, who sponsored fascism, who enabled fascist regimes, who manipulated fascist regimes, and essentially who ended up being the major beneficiaries of fascist regimes. But they are not fascists themselves. And that is very important. In fact, we on the left all too quickly call somebody a fascist when in fact, they're not fascists. They can prove it, so to speak, but they are definitely philofascists. In fact, you could argue that philofascists are more dangerous in a way than the fascists themselves. So I want to talk about these people, and hopefully someday there may be an article on Wikipedia about them, or someday maybe somebody has to write a book or a long article about philofascism. Philofascists typically are people with money and power. So it's people of wealth and influence who can actually are in a position, who are able to take advantage of a movement like fascism. And I will not get involved here now in my personal views about the origins of fascism and the nature of fascism, but most of us have a pretty good idea what it means. Some theories seem to be pretty convoluted, like the ones that Radhika just mentioned there. So I'm more in favor of conventional explanations. But I want to stay with my topic of philofascism. So philofascism is, the philofascists are the people who actually have supported fascist movements, helped to bring them to power, and have taken advantage of their crimes and their wars, and that is very important. These people then are typically the upper class, the elite of a society, you know, the few, as we would say, as opposed to the many, the 1%, as they sometimes say now, as opposed to the 99%. They are people who are not only the bankers and industrialists and capitalists, okay? We have to understand that. They're not only those bourgeois types, they also include members of the old elites, meaning the old former landowning aristocracy, the church, Catholic as well as other Protestant churches, or the Orthodox Church elsewhere. They include also the higher ranking military. They include those kinds of people as well. And they include, for example, when I mention the aristocracies, the monarchies in most countries in Europe. We know, for example, just the other day I saw on television a documentary about the Duke of Windsor, who became King Edward VIII for a very few months only, I guess, in the 1930s, who was notorious philo-fascist. He admired Hitler, and the documentary that I saw just a few days ago on TV focused on his personality and blamed him specifically as an individual for being a philo-fascist. What the documentary, of course, does not mention is that most monarchs, in fact, liked fascism, were philo-fascists in the 1920s and 30s, as soon as after the rise of fascism in the wake of the First World War and the Russian Revolution. I can give you other examples. The King of Italy basically had nothing against Mussolini coming to power and ruling dictatorially, and he remained king, and he was very happy with that, much happier than he was with a democratic system. And the Italian people knew it, and that's one of the reasons why after the war, they basically voted the monarchs out of Italy, and Italy became a republic. And I'm from Belgium myself, and it is a known fact that King Leopold III in 1940 capitulated when the Belgian army was still putting up resistance, and afterwards basically negotiated with Hitler to make sure that there would be a room for a monarch in Belgium and in German-dominated Europe after the war, which he expected Hitler to win, and was probably happy if Hitler would have won. Because monarchs, contrary to what many of us seem to think, are not democrats. I mean, the elites in our societies, whether it's the monarchs, the church leaders, they prefer actually the old system when there was no democracy. And this is really why they flirted with and liked fascism when it popped up, when it appeared on the historic scene at the end of the First World War and in the wake of the Russian Revolution. Fascism for them had the promise of achieving something, or made it possible to achieve something that they were really, or to achieve objectives that they were really concerned with ever since before the First World War already. And that was namely the fact that they were worried about the rise of democracy and about the threat of the specter of revolution. I mean, both the old elites as well as the bourgeoisie had been shocked by a number of revolutions in the 19th century. Well, already in the late 18th century, of course, 1789, 1830, 1848 especially, and then 1871, the Paris Commune. And after that, socialist parties throughout Europe had embraced revolutionary socialism and kept talking about the revolution. At the same time, there were demands emanating from labor unions and from socialist and social democratic parties for reforms, for concessions, for widening of the franchise. And as a result of that, the elites, the upper classes throughout Europe were really, really concerned in a big way, and were looking for, to use that term, a final solution to that problem. And as I write in my book on the First World War, the Great Class War, that war was actually a major anti-democratic and anti-revolutionary project, but it backfired. And it's an irony of history that that war actually produced the Russian Revolution and revolutionary situations elsewhere, as well as the need to make major democratic concessions, such as the introduction of universal suffrage in other countries, to defuse potentially revolutionary situations. And that was, of course, a major problem. That meant that after the First World War, the European elites, rather than having less democracy, as they had hoped to, something that they had hoped to achieve by means of the war, and away with the revolution idea, they had more democracy, and the revolution had become, well, the word of revolution had become a reality, so to speak. It had become flesh in the form of revolutionary Russia, eventually to become the Soviet Union. So that is the context in which these elites then start to look at a new system that appeared, and I will not try to explain now how fascism basically was a product of the First World War. I'll get sidetracked too much, but we all know that that fascism then offered itself as an instrument, you might say, as a weapon, as a means of undoing the democratic concessions that had been made, and of once again somehow doing away with the specter of revolution, which was now incarnated by communist parties in Europe and by the existence of the Soviet Union, which was a model, a source of inspiration. So this is where fascism becomes really, really of interest, to the elites. And Radhika, I think you mentioned earlier how the elites have other ways of achieving their objectives and weapons and means. For example, the old armies and the police, you might say. But the advantage of the Nazi movements was that it seemed to emanate from down below. You know, the fascism itself, as opposed to the philo-fascists who are upper class, who are patrician, who are belong to the few, the fascist parties somehow managed to drum up some popular support. They were plebeian, you might say. You know, they weren't really working class. They were mostly petit bourgeois, to put it that way. Think of a Hitler, for example, Mussolini. They were petit bourgeois types, but they somehow had an appeal. They could speak to the ordinary people the way that the generals and the traditional politicians couldn't. So as the traditional tools of the aristocracy, of the elites, were no longer as effective as in the past, you know, fascism seemed to be a more modern, a more, you know, popular way, a populist way, I should say, of achieving the objectives of the elite. So actually, fascism was a sort of a plebeian instrument in the hands of the elite to achieve their purposes. And as a result of that, as soon as the elites in Europe became aware of the potential of fascist organizations, they started to support them. And they supported them, you know, first of all, with money. It is a known fact that at a very early stage already, people like Hitler received money from big businesses, individuals, you know, as well as corporations. And one individual, for example, and I'm not even talking about German one, but an American individual, very wealthy man who supported Hitler at an early stage was Henry Ford. You know? And there was money coming in to support Hitler already in the early 20s from corporations and banks in Switzerland, for example. You know, and of course in Germany itself, you know, famously there was the great steel magnate Thyssen, who afterwards wrote a book and admitted that he had financed Hitler at an early stage already. So they financed Hitler, and they financed they allowed this small party, and small parties, fascist parties were small in the beginning, to have electoral successes, because as Luciano Canfora, another great Italian scholar, we all know Domenico Lusurdo, but Luciano Canfora is worth looking into as well. He has written a classic book on I would call it classic, on democracy. He argues, and rightly so, I think, that in the 20th century, elections have to be fabricated. That's to say, mass-produced or produced in industrial way by means of big investments of money and time. That, you know, if you don't have money, you can't win elections. We all know that. You have to be a millionaire pretty well these days to be a candidate or to win an election. So it was that kind of money that provided by bankers and industrialists that allowed the likes of Hitler and Mussolini to achieve a certain amount of electoral successes, which without that support, they would never have had. But more important than that, these electoral victories were never big enough for any fascist to win a majority. There had to be also other ways of making it possible for a fascist movement to actually come to power. And that, for example, in Italy involved Mussolini, the first fascist to come to power as early as 1922, via a so-called March on Rome, which was presented later on as basically Mussolini and his followers coming to power because of their own volition. Now, we now know that this was all basically a charade. This was all set up with the help of the monarchy, of the great industrialists, the great landowners, and the Vatican, and all these people who had an interest, who saw the potential of fascism, of a fascist movement becoming a fascist regime to further their own interests. And we also know that Hitler did not become Chancellor of Germany after a major electoral victory, but to the contrary, he was invited to become Chancellor after electoral defeat. Still a major party, mind you, still horsed quite a few votes, but after he had suffered a setback electorally, that's when he was invited. Because that's when the powers that be, the elites, realized that if we don't bring him in now, it may be too late later on. So it was again through intrigue by powerful people behind the screens, and that involved bankers like Mr. Schroeder from Cologne, and Schacht and all these people behind the scenes who basically created fascist systems. So the philo-fascists, in many ways, were the people that, the enablers, to put it that way, of fascist regimes. And I think you can pretty well say the same thing about other fascist regimes that were established elsewhere. But the ones that I'm most familiar with, of course, are the ones in Germany and in Italy. Now, the the fascists come to power thanks to the philo-fascists. And once the fascists are in power, because fascism is not only a movement, it's also a regime, it's also an ideology, I'll talk about that later. Once it's in power, the fascist regimes, like that of Mussolini and like that of Hitler, are very, very useful for the philo-fascists of the upper class, because they do exactly what the upper class wants. And I will focus here on not on the old elites, what they got out of fascist regimes. For example, it is, well, I'll just mention briefly the example of the Catholic Church that got a lot of benefits out of helping Mussolini to power, because the Italian state before Mussolini was actually an anti-clerical state. It was the product of a war of independence of which the Pope had been a victim. You may know that, you may not. But Mussolini made a deal, and actually the Pope got his reward for supporting Mussolini. And out of that came all kinds of laws that Mussolini promulgated, like, for example, no more divorce for women. That's just one example. No abortions. The Catholic Church got a big role again in education, which they had not had in Italy until that time. So there was certainly a lot of advantages for the old elites, such as the church. I like to focus on the role of capitalists and what capitalists, bankers, and industrialists got out of supporting fascists, including Nazi regimes. As I've written a book about that called Big Business and Hitler, as you may know. But what they got out of it was, first of all, the fascist regimes were a wonderful weapon to wage class struggle. Class struggle, on behalf of the elite of the few against the many, especially against the labor movement, against socialist parties, communist parties, and even people who were in other ways inconvenient. And we all know that, for example, in Germany, when Hitler came to power in 1933, one of the first things he did was basically to outlaw the Communist Party, basically fold the Social Democrats, basically eliminate all political parties. But first of all, the communists who represented revolution. So that was the elimination of that revolutionary specter that they were so worried about, the elites. And you may also know that the first concentration camps were established to accommodate the many prisoners who were essentially mostly communists. Too many people assume too readily that the concentration camps were set up by Hitler, for the Jews, and that is not true. The Jews would have their turn, don't get me wrong, but the first camps were set up because the prisons were so chock-a-block full, with socialists and communists especially, that they needed extra accommodations, and that was the concentration camps. The first one, the prototype, being the one at Dachau near Munich. So that is what happened right there. So the class enemy, so to speak, that had been a threat and a nuisance, for capitalism, was immediately eliminated. And of course, fascists elsewhere would do the same thing. And by the way, I believe that Zelensky has recently basically outlawed most labor unions, hasn't he? Because the labor unions also were eliminated, of course, by Hitler. And that was fantastic, because it lowered the labor costs for industrialists in Germany quite big time, you might say. And not only in Germany, by the way, not only for the German corporations, but you may or may not know that American corporations had made major investments in Germany, and their establishments, their foreign investments in Germany also did very well, thanks to Hitler. Thank you very much. So the fascist regimes were useful to capitalists and to the elite in general, because they eliminated, or they helped them fight the class enemy successfully so. In fact, they eliminate, might say, that problem. But even more importantly, one of the big concerns of capitalists, of course, is capital accumulation. That's what it's all about, right? Making money. And making money for capitalists in the 20th century, or capitalism in the 20th century, is capitalism in its imperialist manifestation, right? So to make money, big enough profits, to achieve big enough profits, it can't just be done in your own country. You have to basically go across your borders and expand. That's what imperialism is all about. Well, in that respect, too, fascism was extremely useful, because it was mentioned earlier already. I think, Radhika, you mentioned that, or maybe it was Gabriel who mentioned it, that, for example, under Mussolini, right away, Italy became active, in the imperialist field by expansion into Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Libya, you name it, right? And that, of course, meant that the fascist regimes have the weapons And that's good for business. And that means to buy these weapons, they have to borrow money from the banks. And that's good for the banks because the banks charge high interest rates. Later on, they will claim that Hitler was and Mussolini controlled everything. But in reality, the banks were much in control because they could impose pretty hefty interest rates on the loans they extended to the likes of Mussolini and to Hitler. And these conquests, these imperialist conquests, then this rearmament that is involved and the militarization of society in general, that is also part and parcel of the fascist phenomenon, that brought in a lot of money for the industrialists and for even people who produce uniforms, like Hugo Boss, for example, who made the uniforms for the SS in Germany, as you may know. Fortunes were made. But of course, the problem was also, where is the money going to come from? Hitler had to borrow money from these from the banks to pay the industrialists. So the bankers are happy, the industrialists are happy. But excuse me, Mr. Hitler, and excuse me, Mr. Mussolini, how are you going to pay back your loans? And there the answer is war, war, a great war, which this time we were going to win, not like in 1914-18, because we now have the best weapons we just bought, with the money we borrowed from the banks. And the way we're going to pay back is basically through conquest. The wars we're going to fight are going to be wars of rapine, wars of conquest. And as Caesar already said, and the Romans said, "Vae victis," the losers will pay. And that was indeed the case in the Second World War, for example. One of the advantages for Hitler to overrunning little Belgium, where I'm from, was that all the gold of the National Bank of Belgium, quite a bit of it actually, most of it coming from the Congo, was flipped over to Germany. And so wars of rapine like that helped to pay the banks, the loans back. So that was very, very important. So that was one of the big advantages that Hitler, that fascism, offered to the philo-fascists. That is one of the big reasons why these gentlemen, these most hardly any ladies in those days, still mostly gentlemen, liked fascism a lot, were philo-fascists, because they had invested in fascism, and the returns on investment in fascism were absolutely huge. And we know that the profits in Germany, of corporations in Germany, and of banks in Germany, and of the American corporations active in Germany, skyrocketed in the 1930s already, because of the rearmament program of Hitler. And by the way, the profits made by the oil barons who sold the petroleum, which Hitler's tanks and airplanes would need to wage a war, they made sky-high profits as well. By the way, for German industry, the idea that Hitler would have to fight a war to basically pay back, the banks, and therefore, keep the system going, that this would have to be through a war of rapine, was not a concern at all. And neither was it a concern for the owners of American corporations in Germany, which included Henry Ford, by the way, because it was quite obvious in the beginning that the war Hitler was going to fight was a war against the Soviet Union. And that, of course, meant that this gentleman, who allows us to make fantastic money, is only going to do the dirty work, which we ourselves would love to do, but can't for some reason. He's going to destroy the Soviet Union, the hotbed of revolution, the revolution incarnate, And this was one of the main concerns that I mentioned already before the First World War, and even a bigger concern after the First World War. How to get rid of this specter of the revolution, how to get rid of the Soviet Union. So for the German industrialists who loved the idea of the Soviet Union being wiped out, and for the American industrialists with investments in Germany, who also loved the idea of that country that was the source of inspiration for their Reds in the 30s, of which there were many in the States, that country would be wiped out by this wonderful Nazi, by this wonderful fascist leader that we brought to power, that we enabled, whose regime we enabled. That was not only wonderful, but it was to be complemented by the conquest of an India or a Wild West, to use the names of the places which inspired, of the conquests by the British and by the Americans that had inspired Hitler's desire to go east and conquer basically in India for Germany in Eastern Europe. In fact, the German industrialists spoke about how it would be
Wait, this is wonderful. I'm trying to make sure there is room for the other two speakers.
Yeah, well, I'm going to stop that very quickly. Anyways, the idea for the German industry was that this would be an Ergänzungsgebiet, like a complementary sort of colony for the heavily industrialized German heartland, And that would then give to Germany the raw materials, like the petroleum that it needed, and the very rich agricultural land of Ukraine. And if you think about that, even today, Germany is heavily involved in the crisis in Ukraine, and you bet that they're also interested in the land over there, which Zelensky is selling off for very little money, of course, for big agribusinesses to acquire. So this is these were the things that were very, very useful, that made fascism useful for the people up there, who therefore liked fascism, became philo-fascists. But I want to make it finish off here then. One of the wonderful advantages of the system was that the philo-fascists rarely ever became fascists themselves. Most of them never joined the party. Most of them were never seen in any uniform. There were some exceptions, of course. Maybe we can focus on those, but there's no need to do that. So most of them never touched it. So that allowed these people, these industrialists, these bankers, the church to say after the war, after all the misery, after the wars, it wasn't us. It was them. Plausible deniability is very, very, very important. Better still, not only could you say it wasn't us, it was the fascists. The fascists, these plebeian types, who could call themselves socialists, revolutionaries, anti-capitalists. Yes, it was their fault. They're guilty of all these things. And we just followed orders. We had no power. We just had to do because Hitler was so powerful, and Mussolini, same thing. We could do nothing. We had to follow orders. He forced us to produce weapons. A bit of money in the process, fair enough. But it wasn't us, right? And it was in fact socialism. Even today, as you may know, a lot of people still think that Hitler's National Socialism was a socialism. In fact, it's just a label. It meant nothing. It was used for electoral purposes. But that is one of the advantages, of fascism for the philo-fascists, that they didn't have to do the dirty work themselves. Somebody else did it for them, and they can point a finger at them later on, at the others, and say, it wasn't us. In fact, it was ordinary people who brought Hitler to power, ordinary people who did committed the crimes, not us. We don't get involved in that. So this is actually my comments about philo-fascism, and I'll leave it up to you to think about how today, when fascism is indeed making a comeback, who the philo-fascists are, and how they benefit from that. That is something that, as an historian, I don't have much expertise in that, but some of you follow very closely what's going on, what has been going on in Ukraine, in Israel, in the third world in general. And wherever fascism rears its ugly head, the question to be asked is, who are the philo-fascists? Maybe someday there'll be an article in Wikipedia. Thank you very much.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.